The House Committee on Families, Children, and Seniors will now come to order. Madam Clerk, will you call the roll?
Chair Young.
Here.
Representatives Coffia.
Here.
Glanville.
Present.
Arbit. Edwards.
Present.
McDonald.
Present.
Wozniak.
Here.
Fox. Johnson.
Here.
Thompson.
Here.
Madam Chair, you have a quorum.
Excellent. I need a motion to approve the minutes from June 13th. Representative Glanville moves to approve the minutes. All right. Well, thank you all for being here on today. Today, we will be taking testimony on House Bills 4320 and 4387, introduced by Representative McDonald, known as Justice for Allie, named for Allie Hayes, that protects vulnerable adults with developmental and intellectual disabilities from being sexually exploited online. First, however, we are going to adopt an H1 substitute for House Bill 4320 that creates a felony penalty for subsequent offenses. I need a motion to adopt the sub, so moved by Representative McDonald. Madam Clerk, will you call the roll?
On the motion to adopt, Chair Young.
Yes.
Representatives Coffia.
Yes.
Glanville.
Yes.
Arbit. Edwards.
Yes.
McDonald. Wozniak.
Yeah.
Fox.
Yes.
Johnson.
Yes.
Thompson.
Yes.
Arbit.
The H1 substitute for House Bill 4320 is adopted.
Great, thank you. And now we will hear from Representative McDonald. Representative, you now have the floor. Thank you so much for your work on this.
It's been a long road for lots of people. Thank you, Chair Young and members of the committee. You might know that House Bills 4320 and 4387 are historically referred to as, on the floor, as Justice for Allie. And today I'm honored to be here with the bill's namesake, Allie Hayes, as well as her parents, Dawn and Mark. The Hayes family is here to tell the story behind this legislation, but first I want to briefly summarize the bills and the motivations behind them. Allie is a bright young woman currently studying at Oakland Community College who has lived in Troy all her life. She also happens to have Down syndrome, which means that ever since she turned 18, state law has recognized her as a vulnerable adult. 6 years ago, when Allie was 19, a stranger approached her online. Within 11 minutes, this predator coerced and manipulated her into sending him explicit photos of herself against her will. When the City of Troy attorney brought the case to the Oakland County prosecutor to bring charges, they discovered that the incident was, strictly speaking, not a crime. And let me say that again. Under current law in Michigan, having someone threaten and manipulate a vulnerable adult into sharing sexual content was and is not still a crime. The prosecutor, City of Troy attorney, and Troy Police Department detective explained their frustration and were shocked that there was no pertinent law to apply. While state law protects against the online sexual exploitation of children, it currently contains no protections for vulnerable adults, persons over 18 who require supervision or personal care due to age, mental illness, disability, or who lack the personal or social skills to live independently. These bills aim to close this loophole by making it illegal to knowingly take advantage of someone's vulnerable adult status to obtain explicit images of them. We're hearing these bills today because of the tremendous efforts of the Hayes family, who have tirelessly advocated for adding this essential protection into law, knowing that it will not change their case, but will protect people like Allie moving forward. My team and I have worked closely with members of the disability rights community to ensure that these bills only prohibit someone from knowingly using someone's vulnerable adult status to manipulate them into doing something they would not otherwise do. At the same time, we want to make sure that we're keeping it legal, that we're honoring the rights of vulnerable adults. So we're keeping it legal for vulnerable adults to consensually send explicit images to one another. We have also worked with the Attorney General's office to align the sentencing guidelines in the bills with the sentencing guidelines for vulnerable adult abuse, a separate crime that could not be used to prosecute Allie's perpetrator. A first violation of justice for Allie would be a misdemeanor, punishable by up to 1 year in prison, which is the same punishment for vulnerable adult abuse in the 3rd degree. Any subsequent violation would be a felony punishable by up to 2 years in prison, which is the same punishment for vulnerable adult abuse in the 3rd degree. I would be happy to answer questions on the sentencing guidelines. But just to let you know, also here, the Hayes family is here to testify, and several other people will be speaking as well. They are Detective Christine Schuler of the Troy Police Department, Dr. Christina Marcek-Topolewski and Anne Marie Kelly, experts in vulnerable adult law at Eastern Michigan University, and Dawn Calnan, speaking on behalf of the ARC of Oakland County and the ARC of Michigan. Before I turn things over to the Hayes family, I'd be happy to answer any initial questions.
Thank you again for your testimony. I have a question before we get to other members. Well, you mentioned keeping it legal for vulnerable adults to be able to send materials if they so choose. What does that look like? I'm just trying to be clear about how we know that they're choosing to do this of their own free will. What does that look like?
Well, one of the important points to note in this bill is that it talks about perpetrators using a vulnerable adult's vulnerability itself. So it's kind of in, the person, and whether it's consensual on both sides. So in the case when someone feels forced and threatened into doing something, that would be covered under this law. But for example, if there were 2 adults, whether maybe they both have dementia or Down syndrome or another situation, if they wanted to consensually share images, that would still be okay, and that would protect their rights to do so. This is in the case, there's an expression, you cannot consent to abuse. So that's what we're really talking about here. Has a person been abused in this situation, or is this a consensual act between 2 adults?
Right. You cannot consent to abuse. That's a really good way to
cannot.
put it. Representative Arbit.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Representative McDonnell, for introducing this critical legislation, and I'm so grateful that you have and could not agree more about its importance. I do have a question, and I know I don't have the sentencing guidelines in front of me, but I'm wondering if you know where this crime would stand on the sentencing grid.
I am not aware of that.
Okay. Because there is a companion bill, I assume, for the sentencing guidelines.
There is, and I probably don't even have that in front of me.
No problem. Because I'm looking here, and a few months ago I would not have known to ask this question, but after working on the legislation that I've worked on, I know that that's important because I'm wondering if a misdemeanor punishable by up to 1 year in prison is sufficient for this type of crime, because depending on where it is in the sentencing grid, no one's ever going to get time for that. And the way that I would conceive of this is that this is such manipulative, abusive, mendacious behavior that it's on a sliding spectrum of what someone is going to be capable of doing once they've already done this. Where can they go from there? And so if we're trying to utilize this not only for justice for these types of situations, but also to prevent even more heinous behavior from an individual, because if they can do this, what more are they capable of? I'm not sure that a slap on the wrist, a misdemeanor, for someone who's probably not even going to go to jail, let alone get actual Department of Corrections time for this, no one's ever going to get that 1 year for this misdemeanor, based on my understanding of the sentencing grid, and having familiarity with how this process works. And so I am wondering if maybe, and I know you've had conversations with the Attorney General in crafting this legislation. I'm wondering if maybe we need to tighten, boost that a little bit, because I worry about if we don't get them, have supervision from the court, and have some severe penalty.
Which would come with a felony? Is that what you're telling me?
Well, I think it could come with the possibility to have actual time, right? Which I don't see as happening with a misdemeanor that's punishable by up to 1 year. No one's ever going to get time for that.
Okay. Well, you're sharing with me information I don't know, and I think there is still time to have those conversations. Just so you know, there was a lot of discussion about sentencing guidelines.
Yeah.
And we began with some harsher penalties, but not everyone agreed to them, because also there is a desire, not always to have a first offense go to the penalty range. We could reconsider it, but we did ultimately try to align with other rules, which are pretty much just as heinous when it's abuse of vulnerable adults physically and in other ways. So what we did finally choose was on the basis of the Michigan State Police and what they thought fit in with offenses.
Okay. I appreciate it. Thanks so much, Representative.
I know. I was with you on this journey. We did a lot. It was a bunch of back and forth. And unfortunately, there are times where there are some young people who do the wrong thing and need to be taught how to do things the right way. And so do we want to just quickly give them the first offense felony? There are extenuating circumstances sometimes, Representative. So we're just trying to follow along with some precedent that already exists, and you kind of landed there, and I know that the AG's office worked with you quite a bit on this, so thank you. Representative Glanville?
Yeah, I don't have a question so much as a comment. Having worked in this space for a fair amount of time, particularly I was on the doing internet safety presentations nationwide for about a year or so, schools, community groups, that sort of thing. Had the opportunity to interact with state police across the nation, and this issue, thank you for taking this up. We need to continue moving in this direction, and thank you for your thoughtful consideration of the sentencing guidelines, because there is so much parents, kids, adults, vulnerable or not, are all in the last 5 to 10 years, a very short period of time, have had to learn a lot. Not only about how to use technology, in a technical sense, but how we use it in a social sense, where the traps and pitfalls are. And I really appreciate how you've gone to this, so that we can, like I said, get this moving, use this as a precedent to move forward and continue to build these safety measures into technology use. So thank you so much for your work.
Thank you. And I just have to say the family has been amazing. 6 years they have been working on this, even though it will not affect their own case. So it's just very impressive to work with them.
There being no further questions, thank you, Representative. Okay, next up, we will hear from the parents. Mark and Don Hayes, would you all come? Be certain to press the red button when you're ready. Yeah, and Allie, of course, can come with you. Is there room? Testifying? Okay, she can. If she wanted to sit with them, she could, though, and still give her own testimony.
Okay, easy enough. Thank you.
That's fine.
We call ourselves the Three Musketeers.
I know that's right. All right, thank you all, Hayes family, for being here. Feel free to start when you're ready.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Dawn Hayes. Thank you for the chance to speak to you this afternoon at this esteemed committee meeting regarding House Bills 4320 and 4387. This is the bedroom where our 19-year-old daughter, who has Down syndrome, was assaulted. The predator did not enter through a door or window. The evil came through an electronic device. This is her beautiful smile at the age of the assault. A parental nightmare, this devastation she felt learning she was the victim of an online predator. As mentioned in one 11-minute contact on a social media platform, a predator stole her smile. The predator compelled, harassed, forced, and exploited her. With a chronological age of 19 and an IQ of 65, she was paralyzed by fear. Her impairment left her unable to find the skills to maneuver this unwanted, horrific encounter. Allie's predator admitted under oath that she was targeted because she has an intellectual disability and because she would be easy to trick. Like many predators in Michigan, it is commonly known that this population is unprotected. So they are, in one offender's words, a predator's dream. As a result, she was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder and received weekly treatment for a year at Care House. She was filled with fear, sadness, and we too were forever changed. Allie was no longer herself, doing things like going to work, being a Special Olympian, and riding her bike did not bring her joy anymore. Online sexual abuse is never the fault of a vulnerable adult. It is always the fault of the offender who has committed a serious sexual crime, unless you live in Michigan. Please trust me, I speak from experience. You may be wondering, how big a problem is this? According to an article dated February 17th, 2022, in the American Journal of Preventive Medicine, one study of adults with intellectual disability diagnosis found that 48.1% of the sampled women experienced sexual assault in their lifetime. Your constituents want you to help modernize the Michigan Penal Code so we improve the safety of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities who live in Michigan and use the internet. And if you're wondering if an unwanted online sexual encounter is truly an assault, make no mistake, sexual abuse can happen fully online with zero in-person contact. And Michigan is behind 32 states who already protect their vulnerable populations with modernized legislation. As recently as March of 2021, clarification on what defines sexual abuse was provided by the Journal of Mental Health Research in Intellectual Disability, stating, quote, sexual abuse is defined as unwanted sexual activity of any kind with perpetrators using force, bribery, or coercion, making threats or taking advantage of victims who are unable to give consent due to young age, immaturity, or cognitive impairment, end quote. Although usually unreported by vulnerable adults, sexual abuse can and does happen in online forums daily. Lastly, although this type of abuse occurs virtually, the impact on the victim, their loved ones, and community can be just as harmful as sexual violence committed in person. Please trust me, I speak from experience. Please vote on these bills immediately and help make the internet safer for some of Michigan's most vulnerable. If you have any questions, I'm happy to answer.
Thank you. Dad, did you have anything to add?
I just want to say my wife is an incredibly strong woman who has raised an incredibly strong woman. And as sad as this is for us, We wouldn't be doing this if Ally didn't want to continue to help her friends and people like her. So, as sad as this is at times, this is the right work to do. And we need your help. And we appreciate you guys having us here today.
Thank you. Are there any questions for Mr. or Mrs. Hayes? No? Okay, well, I do know that Ally wants to have a few words. She has a prepared statement. So, young lady, there you are. And the mic is yours. You can begin whenever you want to, Ally.
And the practicing she has done is amazing, so here she goes.
Good afternoon, Sarah Young and committee members. I'm Ally Hayes. I'm 25 years old and consider myself smart, yet a bad person scared me into doing something I did not want to do. Passing these bills will protect me, my friends, and others with disabilities. I am the voice of many. I appreciate the time you give working on this committee. I am Michigan is safer because of you. Please vote immediately so I can feel better about being on my computer and sue bad people will not want to target people like me anymore. Thank you for listening to me.
Thank you for being here. Thank you for being so strong.
Of course.
Wow, we need to be strong like you, Ally. I'm so appreciative.
Me too.
Thank you.
I tell you, right? Oh, my goodness. Okay, we're going to do our best to get this to the governor. Do we have any questions for anyone before we move on? Everybody good? It looks like everyone is good. Well, you all, thank you again for your testimony.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you.
Next, we'll hear from Detective Christine Schuler, there she is, of the Troy Police Department. Feel free to start whenever you're ready.
Good afternoon. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak with you today. I've been supportive of Ally and her family since this started back in 2017. When they made the police report, I was the detective that was assigned to investigate her case. I decided to have Ally interviewed at Care House due to her disabilities, and it was clear based on that interview that she was forced and coerced into doing this and to sending these pictures. I had a chance to interview the offender before the case was complete, and he straight up admitted to me that he used her vulnerability to exploit her, to get her to send these pictures. When the entire case was completed, I sent it up to the Oakland County Prosecutor's Office, and they agreed with me that this was coercive in nature, that there was not a state law that applied that they could charge. Feeling that he should still be charged with something and held accountable, I forwarded this case to the Troy City Attorney's Office, and we got somewhat creative and ended up being able to charge with a city ordinance for using a phone for malicious purposes. But I have been working sexual assault cases, child abuse cases, and cases involving vulnerable adults for 14 years now, and I think it's sad that we, at this point, don't have any laws to protect our most vulnerable, and I fully support this.
Thank you. Any questions for? Okay. All right. Vice Chair? Yes, sir. Wozniak.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just a question on the prior convictions. Is there a statute of limitations on those?
For the prior convictions for this law bill?
For the enhanced sentencing?
Yeah, I'm not sure on that.
There's no recharging our case. Is that what you're asking?
No.
Okay.
For
Anybody to go back?
yeah.
Okay.
Is there a statute of limitations?
I think he means for the second offense, correct?
Or I think he's
Second, third, fourth, whatever.
I'm
Repeat
sorry.
offenders.
I don't have that information, sorry.
Brett Wozniak, that's not how the enhanced sentencing piece works. If someone has been convicted, then for the duration of their life, they can be, if they commit it again, they can be.
That's my question.
Yep.
Yeah.
All right.
I'm like,
No statute of limitations. All right, good.
Okay, 'cause I know
on a
like for
conviction.
for
Statute of limitations only for bringing a case. If you have a
He
conviction
knows
already
that.
on your record, and unless it's been expunged, I assume, an enhanced penalty could be issued.
Okay.
Correct?
Okay, and then I don't know where to direct this question. Enhanced sentencing can occur for defendants having one or more prior convictions, but then in the subsequent sentence, it says having more than one prior conviction. So that seems a little conflictory.
So with that, I will ask the bill sponsor if you could respond to that. Do you have that?
Thank you, Rep. And thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Okay. All right. Okay.
Thank
Thank you so
you.
much. Next, we're going to hear via Zoom from Dr. Christina Marsak Topolewski. She's Associate Professor, Eastern Michigan University School of Social Work, and Anne-Marie Kelly, Director, Disability Planning and Policy Center at Eastern Michigan University. Are you all, okay, there you are. Thank you so much. Feel free to begin when you're ready. Oh, or not. Where'd they go? Okay.
We'll get our slides up. Good afternoon, Madam Chair and honorable members of this committee. Thank you for the opportunity to share our research on this topic. My name is Anne-Marie Kelly, and this is my colleague, Dr. Christina Marsak Topolewski. We're both associate professors at Eastern Michigan University in the College of Health and Human Services. My background is as a health law attorney and the director of the university's Disability Planning and Policy Center. My colleague is a leading national researcher in intellectual disabilities and developmental disabilities and caregiving. She's an appointed board member of the U.S. National Task Group on Disabilities and Dementia Practices. And together, we've published a significant body of work concerning disability matters. We're here today to briefly discuss 10 key policy considerations that prove why these bills need to become part of Michigan law. As part of today's hearing testimony reports, you should have a copy of our executive summary. It's contained on pages 2 through 7 of our report. We want to recognize in point 1 that vulnerable adults are a legal protected class in Michigan. It's already part of Michigan law, and these bills before you, they don't change the existing legal definition that's been in place since 1994. Next slide, please. And so these bills modify the existing abuse protections for vulnerable adults under Michigan law. They support the growing need for more specific laws to try to protect VAs against intentional and knowing acts of abuse. Next slide, please. So as you may know, traditionally, our laws divide groups into 2 different camps based on age. And I want to point out that because vulnerable adults are legal adults, they lose many criminal protection. They lose a lot of protections against criminal abuse on their 18th birthday. And it's so important that we also note that while vulnerable adults, they can exhibit certain characteristics that might seem childlike, they're not children, legally or in any other sense. They can provide legal consent in certain limited situations, but no Michigander, vulnerable adult or otherwise, can consent to abuse. These bills before you today are about intentional and knowing abuse, as proven by a prosecutor beyond a reasonable doubt. Next slide, please. These bills recognize how technologies have changed since the creation of vulnerable adult law in Michigan in 1994. In the last 2 decades, technology provides predators with increased access to communications with vulnerable adults. But these bills work seamlessly within the continuum of legality on your screen. These bills provide clear specifics that it's a criminal act in Michigan to knowingly or intentionally abuse a vulnerable adult with sexually explicit visual material. Now, my colleague, Dr. Marsak Topolewski, is going to tell you about who legally qualifies for the classification of a vulnerable adult.
There are two areas when we start to think about vulnerable adults in two classifications. The first is intellectual and developmental disabilities. These are juvenile onset conditions that happen in the formative and developmental years, conditions such as cerebral palsy, Down syndrome, and oftentimes other neurological conditions, autism and other neurodevelopmental disabilities. Cognitive impairments, in contrast, are conditions that are acquired across the lifespan. These may include conditions such as dementia, which has been indicated earlier. When we start to think about these two categories that would constitute vulnerable adults, a key difference is that for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, these are lifelong conditions. So even though they're juvenile onset conditions that happen in those developmental years, a big misnomer, even amongst experts in the field, if you will, is that these conditions are outgrown, and that's not the case. So when we start to think about the bills and the importance of these bills, we recognize that vulnerable adults are often unable to recognize an abusive situation. Again, vulnerable adults in these two categories, and oftentimes lack the ability to report abuse to their caretakers and discern safe situations. Discerning situations, discerning threat, and discerning the extent of threat are at the hallmark in terms of characteristics of what's really important when we start to think about the vulnerabilities of these two populations within that overarching group of vulnerable adults. When we look at intellectual deficits and cognitive deficits, there's a few things that come to mind that are very important and that are neurologically based and sound. The first is reasoning. For individuals with vulnerable adults, to varying extents, reasoning is impaired. Also, coupled with challenges with problem solving and judgment, really coming into play some of the vulnerabilities that could really stem from some of these more precarious situations when we start to think about abuse and neglect and people really being targeted. The impetus for this bill is really at the forefront of somebody being targeted, Allie, due to somebody really playing on vulnerabilities, recognizing the intellectual function deficits as well as the cognitive deficits that would really coincide with challenges with regard to reasoning, problem solving, and judgment. As a result of these three areas and deficits within these three areas, individuals who are vulnerable adults are ripe targets for abuse regarding sexually explicit materials that are visual in nature. Three main areas to keep in mind are conceptual, social, and practical areas that would come into play. These three areas, when we start to think about neurological propensities and neurological evidence that would support challenges with regard to these three areas, there's a substantive body of literature really backing up these three areas. The first, when we look at conceptual reasoning, these are things such as processing speed, working memory, our ability to express ourselves from a language perspective, as well as receive language, and so forth. Even things when we start to think about generalizability of information, what information might mean in different contexts, in different situations, and with different stakeholders. The second area is social pragmatics, and we start to think about communication skills, our social judgment, cues and nuances, and so forth. These areas are typically and characteristically impaired for individuals with certain lifelong disabilities, as well as acquired disabilities, as we start to think about disabilities that are acquired across the lifespan. And third, our practical abilities. Personal care, and I bring this up for a very specific delineated reason. When we start to think about activities of daily living and instrumental activities of daily living, these are the things that we need to maintain our everyday life, our ability to get up, to get dressed, to feed ourselves. These are oftentimes impaired for individuals who are vulnerable adults, which I say this very, very specifically to acutely tie to the trajectory that vulnerable adults often rely on others, posing additional risks for vulnerabilities, additional opportunities for abuse and exploitation across multiple contexts. One very key thing to think about as we start to think about neurology of the brain, as we start to think about development, as we start to think about developmental incongruence, which coincides with one's ability to develop in a way that would be characteristic to the general population is that chronological age, or the age that one is, 15, 20, 25, and so forth, does not equate to cognitive or mental age. Dawn Hayes indicated this earlier, and I think those words are very poignant and very precise and very important, and a clear need, I think, right now to delineate what that means. Just because somebody is an adult does not constitute the ability to not be vulnerable. And to not necessarily be able to make decisions that would coincide with certain ages. So just because somebody is over the age of 18 and has their own guardianship doesn't mean that age at which they are from a chronological standpoint coincides with their mental or cognitive age. This is oftentimes very misunderstood. In a lot of the talks I do nationally and internationally, it seems to be a very hard concept. And I think it's one that I think really deserves a lot of attention, as a lot of the foundational and framework pieces of these House bills are really predicated on this information here. So individuals who are vulnerable adults, there's three things that I would say kind of as like a highlight that they're at risk for. Certainly at risk for having challenges and difficulties with saying no, whether that's because of expressive language, receptive language, judgment, and so forth, and kind of the combination that would occur. This is a challenge. So when we start to think about exploitation and abuse, right, a lot of these challenges are predicated from this challenge alone. The second is an increased risk for manipulation. We know that populations with intellectual and developmental disabilities, as well as individuals that age with an acquired disability that may impact them to some or varying extents across the lifespan, are really at risk for manipulation, and abuse would coincide. And the third is the inability to recognize a dangerous situation. I pause there because I think this is kind of at the forefront, right? When we start to think about judgment, when we start to think about that ability to discern intent, what somebody's looking for, if they might have ulterior motives, all of these things come into play, and they have certainly some, coinciding effects on the other. So vulnerable adults are at risk for being targeted. They're certainly at risk for online exploitation and abuse, as well as every other form of abuse, sadly. And lastly, they have long-lasting or permanent emotional damage due to some of the challenges when we start to think about conceptualizing, compartmentalizing, and from a clinical standpoint, unpacking, if you will, some of the caveats that might come along with trauma and abuse. The third point is really poignant in kind of the articulation of those long-lasting and permanent emotional damages that would occur. I'm going to pass it over to my colleague, Anne Marie Kelly.
Right. Ladies and gentlemen of the committee, I wanted to point out on sections 6 through 9 of our executive summary, under existing law in Michigan, acts of abuse always lack mutual consent for everybody. Abuse and consent, they can't legally coincide. And these bills reflect that. They reflect that interactions, communications that regard sexually explicit visual material require mutual consent. And you can't consent to abuse. These bills are very clear on that point. There's no legally acceptable reason for abuse against a vulnerable adult that's knowing and intentional. And so, in the same vein, existing Michigan law doesn't allow abuse under any circumstances. These bills specify that such a circumstance regarding sexually explicit visual materials does exist and needs to be clarified in our laws to close a gap. Next slide. Keep in mind that these bills don't include reckless or negligent actions. They don't apply to accidental, unintentional, or inadvertent actions with vulnerable adults. The bill's mens rea, or the perpetrator's criminal state of mind, use the two highest legal standards for holding someone culpable and accountable. And that's so important to keep in mind, that these bills will hold criminals accountable for their actions and deter would-be predators. They don't impede constitutional freedoms of free speech or sexual self-expression in any way. You're free to communicate with a vulnerable adult concerning sexually explicit material, as long as the communications are not consensual. Because again, consent and abuse, they don't go together. Next slide. As a population, vulnerable adults, they face the highest risk of being exploited online, in person. And these bills reflect that the abusers typically seek out vulnerable adults precisely because they are vulnerable. These bills are exactly why Michigan first passed vulnerable adult law in the first place. They need, this class of people, this legal classification, needs special protections. Next slide, please. And so we've talked about the standards of care. I'll let my colleague wrap up to talk about a vulnerable adult's personal legal damages, personal trauma from abuse.
Thanks, Anne-Marie. So one of the very important intentional things to kind of think about is the intentional knowing or exploitation with sexually explicit visual material. Going back to some of the words that were indicated and elucidated earlier, is there is a clear knowing that one was targeting Allie, right? And so when we start to think about that relationship that Anne-Marie, Professor Kelly is indicating, is that abuse is never consented to, right? And so that's a really poignant thing. And so just in conclusion, a vulnerable adult's personal trauma from abuse is often permanent and lifelong. These damages include 1, the serious pain and suffering, and 2, loss of full function. Such damages may be permanent, they may be lifelong in nature, and they may affect someone across multiple contexts, if not all contexts and settings in their life. In comparison to the general population, vulnerable adults usually face greater challenges in processing and healing from abuse. I thank you all so much for your time and for allowing us to be here today. Thank you.
Thank you both for your testimony. Do we have any questions for our experts? Okay. Well, thank you again. All right. Next, we will have testify Dawn Kalman. There she is, Dawn, from the ARC of Oakland County. Thank you for joining us today. Feel free to start when you're ready.
Thank you, Representative Young, and thank you, all members of the committee. My name is Dawn Kalman, and I am the Executive Director of the ARC of Oakland County. We are an advocacy organization that since 1967 has been promoting and protecting the human rights of people with intellectual impairments and developmental disabilities. We have actively supported the full inclusion and participation in the community throughout an individual's lifetime. My 27-year career has been devoted to this work. Today, I am not only speaking on behalf of Allie, I am also speaking on behalf of the ARC of Oakland County members, the ARC of Michigan and its members, and the 181,000 citizens of the state of Michigan who have intellectual impairments and developmental disabilities. There are 2 days that stand out the most for me in my career. One is the day that Allie's mom and dad called me to tell me that Allie had been victimized while innocently being online. The second day was the day that I had to call them to tell them that my research indicated that there was no recourse against this predator. I wish I could tell you that I haven't received any more calls related to online exploitation of our members, but that would simply not be true. This is in no way a singular issue. Sexual violence is a serious and widespread problem. About 1 in 3 women and nearly 1 in 6 men in the United States have experienced some form of sexual violence during their lifetime. That statistic is frightening, but according to an NPR report titled "The Sexual Assault Epidemic That No One Talks About," People with intellectual impairments and developmental disabilities are sexually assaulted 7 times that rate. While it can be a difficult and painful issue, sexual violence in our community is an obligation that our family members, self-advocates, legislators, and professionals must work to ensure a positive life for people with intellectual impairments and developmental disabilities. And that means that we must take on this difficult issue. The good news is that prevention is possible. In our effort to bring awareness, prevention, and education to this silent issue, our organization partnered with the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services and our local community mental health agency, wherein we brought a national sexuality curriculum training to our community. This comprehensive curriculum provides education about health, relationships, and boundaries, and it was specifically designed for individuals with intellectual impairments and developmental disabilities. We believe that education and awareness is just one piece of this issue. It cannot be enough. The gap in legislation is a problem, and it deserves immediate attention. By voting immediately on these 2 bills, you will be joining 32 other states that have created laws to protect their most vulnerable citizens. I appreciate the opportunity to be here, and I open it up to any questions that you have.
Thank you, Director. Colleagues, any questions? Okay, Representative Johnson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Really appreciate this, and I'm wholeheartedly on board. I think we also need to remind parents and ourselves everywhere, we are all vulnerable when we open our eyes to the internet, whether it's on a phone, a computer. The TV now is used for, the internet, not just TV shows. It is unregulated. Anything can come in, and unless people have, they purchase software to screen for that, and that's available too. I would encourage parents, especially young children, vulnerable adults, friends, anyone in that, trying to guard and protect, even my older parents, it's worth the purchase of a type of software like that too. We really are, we have a cultural problem that we need to address. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you for saying that. I hear what you're saying, and I think prevention is definitely a part of the issue, along with education and legislation.
Yeah. A question for you. You said during your testimony that you have been doing this work for 27 years. Yes. And it's taken us, here we are in 2023, still talking about getting this type of legislation on the books. Can you share with us, over these 27 years, what have been some of the obstacles that you've seen? What are folks saying that, it's hard to believe that people would oppose this type of legislation, but clearly that's happened. So if you could just share some of your experience with us around that, I'd appreciate it.
Sure, thank you. So I think some of this is anecdotal. I believe that this is a loophole. I believe that if this was really brought to the forefront, that this would have been voted on many, many years ago. And the fact that it is such a silent issue, I know that you all agree with me, but the fact that Allie Hayes has for 6 years spoken to this is remarkable. And there were many times that she could have given up and that her family could have given up, but they didn't. And so it takes a very unique advocate and leader to continue to speak up and to educate so that we can all come together and make a difference. And it's not too late. It's not too late. But in my mind, let's let Allie not have to come and speak at a hearing again.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Director. Okay. I don't see any other questions. No, I think you're all set.
Thank you.
Thank you. A couple of things. Minority Vice Chair Wozniak, we want to be clear that we were understanding your question, so as related to the statute of limitations. So to my understanding, this bill in particular does not fit under the criminal sexual conduct crime, which is right now 6 years post. Right. So this doesn't fit under that.
That was my question.
Okay, there you go. All right. We always want clarity in Family, Children's, and Seniors Committee, right? When anybody leave, any guesswork. So I don't see that we have any, I see that we have plenty of cards to read in, so if you all would indulge me. We're going to read the ones that we received here in person, and then we have numerous, in excess of what? 30, 40 emails in support, but we will go ahead and read in the cards. Not wishing to speak, but in support of the bill, Nicole Shannon, Michigan Elder Justice Initiative. Not wishing to speak, but in support of the bill, Michelle Roberts, Disability Rights Michigan. Not wishing to speak, but in support of the bill, Sherry Boyd, ARC Michigan. Not wishing to speak, but in support of the bill, Jeremy Murphy, Michigan Developmental Disabilities Council. And not wishing to speak, but in support of the bill, Paul I practiced this too. Stankowitz, there it is. Paul Stankowitz, is Paul here?
That's perfect.
Is that good?
I go by Paul mostly, so.
Okay. Paul S. in the house, you are, Michigan Catholic Conference. And thank you all for submitting your cards in support. We did not receive any cards not in support. And so with that, I don't see anything else. There are no absent members. I need a motion to adjourn. Representative Edwards so moves. With that, committee is adjourned. Thank you.